Hello and welcome to The Sacred Speaks. My name is John Price. I'm your host. And welcome. If you're listening on audio, you can check this out on YouTube as well. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can go check out any podcast affiliate and search The Sacred Speaks. Be sure to share and like and comment. And while I may be slow to respond, I am trying to pump out as many episodes as possible, and I'm reading a ton, as evidenced by the following interview. So I want to get to a couple of housekeeping details, and then we'll get on to introduce you today's participant and then get started. Now, first of all, as always, the episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences, a boutique integrative clinic that my wife and I started years ago. You can check us out at thecenterforhas.com. And we're growing, so we're moving into a new space, and we're also hiring some clinicians. So if by chance you're watching this and you're a psychotherapist who's licensed in Texas or would like to be, give us a call. Look us up on the centerforhas.com. The other piece is that, as always, I'd like to tip the hat to Modern Nations at modernnationsmusic.com. They've supplied the music, the theme music for the podcast. If you hang out to the end of the episode, as always, the song selection Clouds that you heard at the very beginning will be played. So go check that out. Also check out their website. Then what else? Social media, go there. A lot going on, really. Social media has been a little dormant just because I've had energies that are really put into what's going on with the practice. And of course, really reading and lining up a number of these interviews for the podcast and releasing a series that's taking a number of years to create. So hang in there. You guys are great. By the way, I'm enjoying all the comments on YouTube, and there's a good back and forth. So please feel free to comment, get on there and engage with each other. And I'll certainly drop in whenever I can. Other than that, what else is there? Yes. Check out The Sacred Speaks, of course, at thesacredspeaks.com. There's a page up there now that's a little hint at what the website will be, but the website should be up whenever it's up, hopefully soon. And check that out when you can. So today, I got to thank Jeff Kripal. I'll certainly thank him at the beginning of the episode. Dr. Sarah Costello and I really rapped about that for a little while. This is the book in question. Jeff said, you got to read this book. It's the Routledge Companion to Ecstatic Experience in the Ancient World. And it is precisely what I've been looking for. So I'm really happy to meet you and connect with you, Sarah. Thank you for Dr. Costello. Thank you for doing what you're doing and putting this together for geeks like me. And let me just read you a couple of the chapters. There is, of course, Sarah Costello's work, contextualizing the study of ecstatic experience in ancient old world societies. Not only ecstasy, pouring new concepts into old vessels, Etzel Cardenia, and then a chapter I'm reading right now that's blowing my mind, from shamans to sorcerers, empirical models for defining ritual practices and ecstatic experience in ancient, medieval, and modern societies by Michael Winkelmann. This goes on and on. Psychoactive plants in the ancient world, ecstatic speech in ancient Mesopotamia, ecstatic experience, the proto-theme of Near Eastern glyphic language family. Holy shit, that's a long title. And which is great, by the way. Dr. Stein, thank you for putting together this book. Dr. Foster, psychedelic art and ecstatic visions in the Aegean. Ghosts in and outside the machine, a phenomenology of intelligence, psychic possession, and prophetic ecstasy in ancient Mesopotamia, by John Z. Wee, Dr. Wee. I'm looking at the Mycenaeans and Ecstatic Ritual Experience by Dr. Susan Lupak. Writing for the Dead, Welcoming the Solar Eye Goddess and Ecstatic Expression in Egyptian Religion by Dr. Darnell, John Coleman Darnell, on. And I'm going to be talking to a number of these folks. But in particular, it was great talking with Dr. Costello. She and Dr. Stein and Dr. Foster edited this volume and put it together for us. Routledge is putting out an extremely expensive book. Textbooks, I could go off on this, have inflated their price so much. I'm sure they have some reason, hopefully, to do that, but it is not a cheap book. But it's a valuable book. I've certainly got advantage because I'm going to do a podcast on as many participants or many contributors as I can. But I want to read you Sarah's bio, a little bit from her CV, and then we'll get started. Dr. Sarah Costello has taught art history at UHCL, University of Houston Clear Lake, since 2014. She teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in the humanities and in the history of ancient art. She was the recipient of the UH Provost's Teaching Excellence Award in 2012. Dr. Costello's research focuses on the visual culture of the early periods of ancient Near East. In her writing, she investigates the social contexts of visual culture, especially how people store and communicate ideas and how imagery relates to religion. She's a project leader of a collaborative research initiative with Houston's Menil Collection. If you have not been to the Menil in Houston, it is one of the energetic centers of the world. I'm slightly kidding. And it's a fantastic place. The Menil is in Houston. If you're ever in Houston, definitely put the Menil on your list of places to go. Focused on the art of the ancient Mediterranean world, she's conducted field research in Cyprus, Turkey, Israel, and Greece, and in 2013 studied in Greece as a Fulbright Fellow in the summer session at the American School of Classical Studies. Basically, she's an all-around badass, and it was great to chat with her. Sarah, thank you so much. And I just want to jump in. I know I said I'd read her. I think you got it. That's look up her stuff. I've got links to the book. Look below, as always, in the liner notes or the podcast notes, and you'll find links to a lot of this, what we're talking about. Check out the podcast. Check out Dr. Costello's work, and look forward to many more conversations on ecstasy and antiquity, art, psychedelics, religion, and the like. So thanks for being here. For now, we'll leave it there, and see you next time. Sarah Costello, I was just telling you how excited I am to read this book, and I know I've reached extreme geek level on my because Jeff Kripal, I got to give credit where credit's due. Jeff Kripal pointed me in your direction, and I've started reading the Routledge Companion to Ecstatic Experience in the Ancient World, and the title and the table of contents are just fun to connect with. As anybody listening or watching, you'll know very soon, for those of you who've been following the podcast, why it's so cool for me to be having this conversation, because I think, Sarah, what your work is doing is really providing a new perspective and a new voice to this thread about religion and cult religions and mystery traditions and certainly psychedelics, but also alternate states of consciousness in general, and healing and soul work in all these different cultures. So I'm excited that you and I can connect in your arena and how you reflect on these subjects. I've just been really looking forward to our conversation. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. And I also really appreciate Jeff Kripal putting us in touch. He's like, the man behind the curtain.
Yes.
So yeah, he's been a really generous colleague. I'm grateful to him.
I think that's a universal of his. I think he's generous of spirit. And for anybody listening and watching, check out, I've interviewed him on this podcast 3 times. And I think I can't wait for the next time, because it's always a new opening. But this arena is something that the paranormal and religion and alternate states, ecstatic states, they all these disciplines come together in really nice ways. And I think just to let's tee people up a bit. First, I'd love for you to be able to talk about who you are and what you do, and then as we talked before, I really want to talk about your process related to how you come to the conclusions that you do as an art historian. Is you technically art historian, anthropologist? What's your title here?
Yeah, it kind of depends on who I'm talking to. Because I'm an archaeologist, probably top, like that's probably category 1 is archaeologist. Also anthropologist, also art historian.
All right, a seat at the table. We got 3 different disciplines in one person. Yes, good. Okay, so if we could talk about that, how you come to analyze antiquity, and I really want to talk about this thing that you and I think are both going to really jump up about, the kind of issues that we have when people take modern day psychology, art, history, perspective, and project that onto antiquity to validate a current perspective. I want to go down that thread as much as possible, but you and I have a lot to explore. So would you just let people know where you're coming from first, and then we'll kind of figure out where we go from there?
Sure.
Thanks.
So, yeah, like I said, I guess I would call myself first and foremost an archaeologist. So I study the ancient world through the perspective of archaeology. So that's material culture, right? So that is the stuff that people leave behind, as opposed to a historian or a classicist who might be reading texts. I'm looking at the garbage, right? That people left behind. That's not to say I'm not interested in the texts, because I am, but there's only so much any one person can do, right? So that's not my focus. And then within that, and my husband's also an art historian, and I know he loves it when I characterize art history this way. I see art history as this like very, very small subset of archaeology. So it's the visually interesting stuff that people make. So when I'm looking at the material remains of the past, I'm particularly interested in the really visually rich material. So that's kind of where the art history comes in. Yeah, and my area of specialty is Mesopotamia. Um, so I'm not a classicist. Yeah.
Well, so put some boundaries on that for people. Like,
Mhm.
let's talk about Mesopotamia, and there are even nuances in what you're saying, because I want to find out if when you say art history, what comes to my mind is what you're meaning. And
Okay.
so,
So what
so
comes to your mind?
I mean, I'm kind of cheating, because I read some of your book, and I I'm art, I think, was a different medium. It had a different meaning tendrils to it. I think we look at antiquity, and this is again my naive or amateurish perspective. I don't think when we say art, like an art gallery or art today, it's the same thing as art then,
Yes.
and so that's what I want to find.
You're getting an A in my class
Yes.
already.
Good.
Yeah, that's like that's
Yes.
lesson number one of the
Can you write
semester.
that down so I can put it on my wall? Is
Yeah,
that good?
yeah,
Okay.
you
Yeah.
got an A. Um, yeah, exactly. So art, when I say art, it's always in air quotes.
Yeah.
Because as you said, when we think about art today, we kind of think about, I mean, what comes to my mind immediately is people like sipping a glass of Chardonnay while staring at something on a wall and going, oh, you
Yes.
know, and that's not, it's typically and obviously there's a million different kinds of art and a million different motivations for making it. But typically today, art is sort of made to be appreciated as art, right? And when we're talking about art in the past, it's not made to hang on a wall and be appreciated as art. I'm really talking about just visual expressions that could have
Mm-hmm.
been created for all kinds of purpose. And we look at that within the field of art history, because you're using the same, you're using the same skills. It's visual analysis, it's close visual analysis. So whether you're looking at a contemporary painting or something from long ago, we employ these visual analysis skills to understand it. And then, of course, I also throw in all of the context, the historical and archaeological context.
Yeah. I mean, you start dipping into like philosophy and aesthetics and the how
Mm-hmm.
that evolves. I want to plant this early on because I think Eric Neumann is a Jungian fella who Jung and he were contemporaries. They interacted a lot, and I think that's right. Whatever. So one of the things he wrote about is the movement of the aesthetic expression from the piazzas or the city where communities would come together, and they would look at, in the Italian Renaissance, they're looking at fountains and then churches and then sculptures and how marketplaces evolved, and then fashion came online, and then people moved from having particular textiles and cuts of textile into having particular makers who make the clothing. And now we write that designer or maker on the outside of our clothing because it's a status symbol as opposed to something that's kind of deeply connected. So I can get a bit cynical there, but
Mm.
is that part of the thread that you're talking about as well?
I don't know that I ever thought about it in those terms, but I think there's really interesting questions to ask
Mm.
there about communities versus individuals. And you think about like the ancient Greek world and the investment that they made into public places to gather and making those places beautiful, right? Um, versus, a different moment in time, maybe when the investment is being made into whether it's a palace or someone's personal property, right? Like, are you community focused or are you individual focused? Are you elite focused or community focused? I don't know if that's what you were
Kind well,
getting
that
at with the
actually, yeah.
piazza versus like the personal.
Well, that adds a really interesting thread about you can get into democracy and capitalism and all kinds of other individual. That is an interesting thread, but we're at the risk of like diving deep into a new that's a fascinating thread that maybe we want to pick up on. Um, I don't want to steer us too far off the path here. So, what got you into all this? Let's get just a little context to who you are related to these three
Uh,
disciplines.
sure. I mean, I think I've always been really interdisciplinary in my interests. And I guess if I go back to sort of thinking about what caught my attention in college, I had the sort of classic liberal arts education, a little bit of everything. And I went to a Jesuit institution,
Mm.
um, which was very formative, I think, in my thinking about religion, certainly. But I was interested in art history at that time. And then we didn't actually have a lot of archaeology at Georgetown at that time, but I got into it through art history and actually through some medieval classes I was taking. And I kind of just started going further and further back into time. And I found the further back I went, the more interested I was. So that continues to happen, actually. I went, even since I've got my PhD, I went from like late Neolithic to early Neolithic, and I love to kind of play in the Paleolithic. So yeah, I'm attracted to older time periods. I think in part because we don't have the texts. Um, and it does make it feel more like, I don't know, I don't want to sound flip, but more like a kind of playground for your mind to problem solve in, right? Because we know so little that we have to build interpretations based on really fragmentary evidence. And then it's a matter of how do we do that and still do it responsibly? Like, not jump to too many conclusions, but still come up with something really interesting. And I think that's the part of archaeology I've always really enjoyed.
And one thing about doing a dissertation or really any creative work, where by the nature of creativity, it's something that wasn't really there before. And when you look at the antiquity and all these areas or disciplines of study, what does your particular discipline contribute to the broader whole as we evolve our knowledge of antiquity and how we relate to history?
Yeah, I mean, so you mean archaeology
Yeah, yeah.
or
I
the
mean, practically speaking, just so we can kind of help orient somebody who, can kind of begin to get a toehold in this conversation. When you think about your perspective and your expertise, what are you bringing to the conversation?
right,
For
right, okay.
example, in this book and in your work.
Sure. I mean, okay, so for me personally, um, I think because there honestly aren't a lot of people who are focused on imagery from, say, the Neolithic period. There's some, but there aren't a lot, and that's because there isn't a whole lot to work with. So it's not it's not really a widely popular field. So bringing that perspective of saying, hey, we have something really visually exciting here at Gobekli Tepe, for example, or at Çatalhöyük, and can we start to sort of analyze this in a symbolic way, analyze it in a structural way, contextually, whatever approach we take to analyzing the visual material. I think it brings, okay, well, this could really get me off in a tangent. So
please
slow my
we'll
roll if you want to, but there's archaeology tends, as I said, it's the stuff. So it tends to focus on things that are kind of material and economic, right? Because that's what you find. You find evidence of what people were eating, or what crops they were growing, or what kinds of buildings they lived in, what tools they used. This is very sort of material economic stuff. What we don't find traces of archaeologically is what people were thinking about, because that doesn't leave material traces. If they write it down, that's when the texts become very helpful. But when we're talking about situations where we don't have texts, or even whole groups of people who didn't write texts, which is even in historical periods, a large percentage of the population, accessing what people believed, what they thought about, what their values were, is challenging archaeologically. And that's kind of the area I've always found particularly interesting, and hence art, right? Because when you are looking at visual material, pictures, symbols, aesthetics, as you said, like, you're starting to see what's in people's minds, what's important to them, that they're going to, everyone has to eat at some point during the day, but you don't have to make a picture of something. So if you're doing that, you're doing it because it matters to you in some way, right? So my kind of interest then is getting into that upper level of inference and interpretation of kind of what's happening in the cognitive area.
Well, that gets us squarely into one of the you're like
I'm like, I do not know if I explained that clearly at all.
You didn't know. I mean, it gets us into looking at this issue about process, because your tradition is looking at symbols and expressions of seemingly, I mean, because I immediately go to this kind of archetypal paleo symbolic aspect of the ways in which we've expressed ourselves. And certainly we can get quickly into language and then psychology, and then like we can go all kinds of different directions. But what comes up for me there that I do want to get to today is, what's your process? I mean, how do you, I'm assuming that given the nature of interpretation, that you have to be very careful and aware of I just imagine that the academic container has provided you a lot of structures in order to not project too much into that. Or do you allow yourself to totally project into it? Because, like, do we go into that now? That's the question. Let's go there now.
Okay.
What is your process of how you come to know what you know? And then we can get to some of this book, because I want to quote you in a bit. But yeah, talk about the process.
I would say I'm really conservative in my interpretive process, and if you think about a site like Göbekli Tepe, and for people who aren't interested, maybe we can put
go there.
A link to that. But this is an early Neolithic archaeological site in southeast Turkey that has megalithic stone structures covered with incredible images, carvings on them. I mean, this place is just full of really rich imagery and architecture at a time there isn't much architecture. Like this is way out there. And because it's so exciting, a lot of people are interested in looking at it, right? And so in something I've written, I sort of lay out like, here are in one paragraph, 5 different ways people have interpreted the images at Gobekli Tepe, right? You could look at it, you could call it this, you could call it that, you could call it this, you could call it that. And they have good reasons for doing that. I really shy away from that because I think even getting into things like archetypal ideas, or our minds are really complex.
Yeah.
And we can think about things, 1,000 different ways. So I don't want to assume that somebody who lived, 12,000 years ago was thinking about the world, say, in terms of like male, female, light, dark, structural contrasts or something. Like maybe we do that sometimes, but we don't do that all the time. So I don't want to impose that on their reading of the past, or I don't want to assume that a fox meant, wily like it does to us, right? Maybe foxes meant something entirely different to people who were living then. So I try to be, this is what I mean when I say I'm conservative, I try to be really careful about not projecting meaning into things. Instead, going back to what do we know? Like, what do we know about the time period? What other information do we have? So contextual information that I can use to try to understand this. And then, and this might interest you, getting into sort of cognitive science a little bit in the brain, and what are cognitive universals? Like, what do our minds all do? Like, when we see the world, for example, we categorize the world into, buckets of some kind, right?
Yes.
Because it's too much to take in. So this is just something our brains do to process information. So are there ways that I can take these really elemental cognitive universals and use them to help me understand how people were thinking in the past? And then when do you stop and say, okay, now beyond that, I can't say anymore because I don't know. So knowing kind of when I can say, hey, I think this might be happening, and then when I have to say, but beyond that, we don't know.
So what I find myself wanting to visit with your early self, and what were the things that really blew your mind about this process that you're in, involving archaeology, anthropology, and art history?
Well, you'll love this. I think, when I talk about like being in college and kind of getting interested in earlier and earlier stuff, I definitely got really interested in sort of the period around early Christianity, sort of Gnostic texts, and like, where does Christianity come from? And what world was that? And what did that world look like? And how were people thinking? And how did these ideas develop? And I think some of that was because, I mentioned the Jesuits. One of the best classes I took in college was a class on biblical literature, which was all about how the text of the Bible came together. And just from a historical perspective, that was really fascinating to me. And that kind of drew my interest then back to that time period. So I started in graduate school studying biblical archaeology. And then for really various reasons about just who was available for me to work with and where I could go and excavate and stuff like that, I moved away from kind of the Bible lands, so to speak, and moved east a bit and was working in Turkey, which is northern Mesopotamia. So if you think of Mesopotamia is mostly ancient Iraq, but the northern part of it Turkey and Syria were part of the same kind of cultural interaction sphere. And at the time that I was in graduate school, Americans could not work in Iraq, but they could work in Turkey and Syria. So we suddenly, I mean, this is like, I'm always interested also in the history of the discipline, but suddenly all this work was being done in northern Mesopotamia, which had always been considered the hinterland in a sense, because what was really happening, first cities in the world ever in southern Mesopotamia, southern Iraq, that was the exciting place, and the north wasn't. But suddenly we're doing all this work in the north, and it turns out the Neolithic there is really interesting. So some of it was just circumstance, but I ended up moving geographically into that area and then moving temporally back into earlier time periods, and it really captured my attention.
Well, it seems like the larger population, I mean, there are conversations of this nature that are happening in larger spaces. I mean, this is obviously something that a lot of people are looking at then. So you really kind of fell into that opportunity, right? Right time, right place.
Yeah. And then within that, I mean, so then archaeology, you can ask any number of questions of the material that you excavate, right? You can ask economic questions, and you can ask questions about settlement patterns and about subsistence and about tool use and architecture. And the questions that have always interested me are the ones about the mind, as I said, so that's kind of what captured my attention as a researcher.
Well, I'm curious how much we can pull on this thread, because you said Turkey and I thought Magi, and is that a territory that you can speak to with regard to any of that? Okay. I got a couple of people I've talked to that are really interested in particular, Turkey, Iran, and that kind of the Magi tradition that was moving across there.
No, I'd be interested, to learn more, but that's not something I've worked on.
So religion is, though. Yeah. So what did it look like? What were people thinking then?
What were people thinking? Wait, let me
be careful.
Go into divinatory mode. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you get from with so much energy? I'm sure there's funding that's happening over there too. Like what's happening right now during this period of time related to our current perspective and the interest in this area that you're studying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a great way to ask the question, is sort of what's coming from our interests, right? Because that's what always happens when you study the past. You look for for yourself, wherever you go, there you are.
Yes.
And
yes.
So when we've, as a field, when we've kind of studied the time period, when I talk about early Mesopotamia, I'm talking about the Neolithic period, and then up into kind of developing into the first cities. That's been studied really as a kind of economic question, right? Because we're, as a modern society, modern meaning the last 50 years, say, we're economically driven. It's like our only value in this country, isn't it? Is sort of capitalism. So I think it's really hard for us to get away from that and not think about things in those terms. So those are the questions: subsistence, trade, right? Who was trading with whom? Who had resources? It's like a big game of Settlers of Catan, and you trade your resources around the globe or something. And so it's all about resources and economics and exchange, and how those things are, I mean, it's true, right, to some extent, drivers of societal change and innovation. So that's the big overarching question. And what I've really been trying to do in most of the work that I've done is say, hey now, I think there are other things going on here. So seals, for example, I work a lot on seals, and seals are firmly in that economic category in terms of the way they are typically studied. They are used as part of economic transactions at that time period. And I kind of keep saying they have some really interesting pictures on them too, and they're not always used in economic transactions, and there's more to it than that, and we really need to think about seals differently. And could we kind of stop talking about economics for just a second and talk about, the myths, the stories, the
Yeah,
beliefs, and magic? Like, could these objects have been believed to really hold power that was
right.
being transferred through transactions? It's not something that I think people in our culture are comfortable talking about. I mean, this whole topic, right? I mean, the ecstatic experience in the ancient world book, the whole reason we wrote this book is because we were kind of tired of getting that, like, oh, put on the brakes there. You're talking about something we're not comfortable with. We're like, let's push it. Let's push it out there. Get comfortable, people.
Okay, so let's just take that and go there because that'll um yeah. So you're talking about a felt sense of pressure from a kind of older way of thinking that's not allowing for progress um, in thinking, right? There's a unconscious kind of and sometimes conscious suppression that happens, certainly in any circle, but in academic circles.
Mhm.
And this is a subject, ecstatic experience, alternate states of consciousness, that has up until now been contained and at the baseline so that it doesn't even get out. Like these papers, these ideas, they're not even getting out to be discussed, and now they are.
Mhm.
Uh, well, that's very exciting. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
why do you think? Well, hang on. Before we go in, let me read this because this book has blown my mind. Again, great, great read. And I want to start with your words, and use that to jump in because it was in the first. You just started off this way. Sorry, that is, yeah, that's you. Yeah, there we go. Ecstasy, trance, soul flight. These powerful and potentially transformative elements of ancient experience have long been left to the fringes of archaeological research. This is due in part to our own cultural unease with the esoteric. A historiographic review reveals several key reasons why archaeologists may have shied away from this subject in the past, so on and so forth. So, leading with your first three concepts or ideas in the introduction of your chapter one in this book is ecstasy, trance, and soul flight. Thank you for that, because this is the reason why I want to get into this. I'm very interested in the psychology of religious experience and how we make meaning in our lives. And so I think, and Jeff Kripal, certainly we can talk about him, but because the things we don't understand get kicked out of healthy discourse, and just because we don't morally align with them, or we don't like them, or they don't match our current value system. I love this thing you said about when you look at the past, you look for yourself. And so we have to really position this in a powerful space because these are powerful forces that exist in us, just the nature of what we're talking about. So talk about that. What have you seen in your trade? Because it sounds like these ecstatic experiences are all over the place from my perspective, but
Mhm.
that's one thing I've been excited to talk to you about.
Yeah, and what's great is, and our book doesn't even scratch the surface,
Yeah.
and apologies to people who are out there saying, hey, why didn't you ask me to write a chapter in your book? I work on this stuff. People are working on it, right? And they have been working on it. it's just very difficult to get those ideas into the larger discourse, right? To get other people to accept it and talk about it. It just keeps getting pushed aside as being sort of fringe. And I kind of came up against, and some of the early work I was doing on the early Neolithic and on the images, when I encountered David Lewis Williams' work on caves and the shamanic interpretation of cave art. And I immediately saw in what he did parallels to what I was looking at from this, from the Neolithic, which is later. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is a terrific sort of opening for me to understand these images. And it all kind of made sense. It really fit. And as I said earlier, I am very conservative and careful in the way I interpret things. So while I'm proposing that kind of a model, a sort of shamanic model for understanding some of the images on early seals, I'm also really open to someone else coming along and saying, yeah, no, here's why not. Let's look at it this way instead. It's just a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm making my contribution to the conversation and someone else can make theirs. But coming back to your question, as I started to kind of develop my argument, I swiftly realized that there were going to be people who weren't going to like it because of the reasons I sort of talk about in that chapter. People who are, hey, that sounds that sounds too, too 60s, that sounds kind of too fringe, or we don't talk about shamans, that's too universalizing. There's all kinds of reasons to just say we're not going to talk about that set of things.
We also don't talk about how we're basically in an alcohol cult in the United States.
Can you say more?
Well, I'm reading Winckelmann's book, his chapter, and he's looking at the ways in which we cross-culturally analyze these various substances that are used in cultures. And I could read you the description of an alcohol cult and what the politics are and the economics and the communication and the social structure. And it's like, well, yeah, that's
yeah.
So, but that's something that I think is important in this conversation, is that we think we've grown out of the past, but we haven't. I mean, we're living out all of these dynamics, and that's where I get into really a confusing place with the universal versus the particular, because there are certain patterns that are eternal in our human experience. Now, how we interpret those patterns are up for grabs, right? That we got culture, we've got identity, we've got all kind of different things that exist there, but the nature of life, death, like birth, family, community, conversation, expression, art, these exist seemingly cross-culturally. So when I make the comment about an alcohol cult, I'm really kind of being tongue-in-cheek just about how we aren't conscious of the culture and the religious norms that we live in, because we lack a real understanding of what religion is. And I think that's what's so powerful. When we look back at antiquity, we can say, oh, there's these powers and forces that are a little more early in our evolution, and we can get shreds of reflection of what it's like for us, being that we're like fish in water trying to view ourselves.
Yeah, so that was the point that I really I wanted to make strongly in the article that we wrote, my co-editors and I, for The Nation, this piece, right? Which is sort of the reaching a wider audience, which is something maybe we should talk about too. But I don't think it came across as clearly as I wanted it to in there. But the idea that, like, people today are dealing with a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of anxiety. This is your whole job. You help people deal with this, right? People are dealing with a lot, and looking to all different kinds of means to help them through that process. And I think it really is powerful to be able to look back into the most distant past and say, guess what? People always needed ways to solve those problems, to find community, to connect with something bigger than themselves. I think we have these incredible brains that, I don't know, I'm like an amateur. I'm interested in evolution in a very amateur way, right? That's my like little dip my toe in anthropology thing. But what with evolution, you get sometimes these unwanted byproducts, right? Like our brains are capable of so many things, but I feel like an unwanted byproduct is like the noise, the anxiety, that we know there's too much all the time, and we're social, but then you get too worried about the social, right? You need the social, but everyone's also freaked out, especially right now, right after the pandemic. Everyone's like, people. So trying to deal with our own brains, I think you need a kind of ordering in the universe, whether you want to call that spirituality or cosmology or belief or something. And knowing that people in the past were using some of like similar techniques of ecstasy, right? To try to transcend the noise a little bit. I find that a really reassuring idea, that this is something that's universal in a sense, right?
Well, we would say in modern terms that there's a psychotherapeutic value to a kind of religio magical spiritual process that connects us with something that's beyond our kind of recognizing that we have limitations in our comprehension and our perception. We are benefited immensely by being in relationship with something that's greater than that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a we could say that's a universal, right? Is that I want to let you be my teacher for a minute, and you push
I
up
don't
against me
know.
when I make mistakes.
I'm careful about universals,
Yeah.
but I do think that's probably in some sense a universal. Now, whether that means on an individual level, no, but like generally in the human population across time, sure.
And so am I in this is I get to talk to really cool people who are experts, so I get to mine this territory. Am I fair? Is it a fair statement for me to say that as closely as we can imagine, there are these eternal patterns that show up cross culturally, and one of them is a relationship with the transcendent, or some image of the transcendent spontaneously emerges in cultures across time and space through our human development?
Yeah, I would be hard pressed to find an exception to
Yeah.
that. Yeah. And, so take from that what you want to, right? Does that mean people are seeking it and finding it because it's there, because there is a God of some, or is it a way our brains are dealing with themselves, with with their big braininess? Is it something more like, what Kripal might write about this, or some of that tradition of the kind of radio filter model?
Yes,
I think is super cool.
it is. Yeah.
Maybe, like, it's
The
not
the
my job.
brain the
It's
brain as intent.
it's not my
Yes.
job to say. Um, I really loved when I was doing the research for that chapter, and I found Margaret Mead, because Margaret Mead is sort of, classic anthropologist. Like, you cannot argue with Margaret Mead. And she got into the kind of paranormal a little bit,
Yeah.
and her quote was like, "Don't confuse study with belief." Like
Hmm.
if people are having experiences, study them. If if people are having ecstatic experiences, study them. Whether we believe some belief behind it is, I mean, it's not even really, it's not the point. It's not my job. I'm sure it's someone's job, but that person would be a, you know, a religious specialist, which I, you know, I mean, a priest sort of person. That's their job to say
I
what's
had
really
a
going on. All I can say is, yeah, people are doing this. The behavior is there, the experiences are there. What it means about the universe is like totally beyond me.
that's and I like that space of uncertainty. You know, there's a book that's been on my desk for a while called The Cloud of Unknowing, and it's this mystical recognition of mystery. And what I can't understand is that so much of our current religion is so declarative, and I really struggle with that because the further I push into religion, the more and more I understand the kind of how mysterious that this whole thing is, and that's exciting. You know, I just think
Mhm.
it scares a lot of people to what happens after you die. We have no idea. Like, isn't it interesting that we tend to imagine though that there is something there, and
Mhm.
that me not making a claim or even stating that with a question mark is not meant to be offensive, but just to recognize that there are aspects of reality I can't possibly comprehend.
Yeah, yeah.
But see, this gets into your territory because then you have these symbolic expressions of the ways in which human beings have worked this stuff out:
Mhm.
relationships, sex, alternate states of like birth, reproduction, you know, all eating, family, you know, these core values that are expressed, and we hurt when we don't get them. And that art on some level picks up our way of representing those mysteries.
Mhm.
How are we
Sometimes.
see, good, yes, say more.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I find also really fascinating is, I don't know, is it just the chance of archaeological preservation and discovery, but or we have these moments, you know, I mentioned Göbekli Tepe several times. We have this
Yeah.
sort of early Neolithic, well, you could say Paleolithic, first of all. You have, you know, this incredible visual expression that you find in caves, not only in Europe, but elsewhere in the world. You have this early Neolithic sort of Göbekli Tepe and related sites. And then you have a late, middle to sort of later Neolithic, just this one site, Çatalhöyük. There's other things too, but Çatalhöyük is the really exciting one with just crazy stuff painted on walls. Um, but but in between, right, things go quiet. And
Mm.
what's happening then? Like why aren't why aren't people carving stones full of crazy pictures and, you know, putting, you know, making masks, and maybe they are. I mean, that's so that's the other thing about archaeology is you never know, because maybe they were doing all these things, but they were making them out of materials that didn't stand the test of time. It's all ephemeral and we've lost it. And that's you know, that's a likely answer. But still, it does seem like you have these, you know, gaps in that evidence. And if it is so important, if it is a universal, right? Why is it so much more intense at some moments than others? And does that reflect? And these are the questions I find myself asking, right? Does it reflect moments of stress in a society? Is it
Hmm.
anxiety? Is it change? You know, I read once someone's idea, sorry, I don't remember who, about Paleolithic cave art, maybe being part of like a tension between the different groups of people who were living in Europe at the time, the, you know, archaic humans and the modern humans sort of interacting, and that the stress of that interaction was behind this visual expression.
It certainly works intuitively, doesn't it?
Yeah,
You know,
and
you
that's
just
that's the
turn on the
dangerous
radio and
thing,
you're
though, when
that
things
I get
work
it.
intuitively, and then
Yes,
you get too attached to an
I see
idea,
that.
and it's not supported by evidence.
But
That's
what I
fun.
what I like about what you're doing here is you have the voice of a skeptic without falling into cynicism. You know, there's it's almost like in your training you have just inborn in you this kind of like, but maybe not. You know, and so it's to keep you from getting too fixed because
Mhm,
you're the investigator, and if you don't go through your judo training and learn how not to like give into the dark side of the force and speak in absolutes, you know, that you're so that's a real healthy narrative or a real healthy ethic for you. But I do want to when you were saying gaps, I was ready for you to say cycles. And I notice and so with you nodding, I want to look through that because if we can look at history and see certain cycles related to culture and the interplay of the the economics and government, then I think that's a pretty cool narrative. I don't know what it does for us because we tend not to even look. I had a friend of mine once say that when the Desert Storm is happening, he wishes that the people in power would have read Thucydides and just simply understood that this is not a new reality for us, the way that we fight each other and
mhm.
what happens in the aftermath. Um,
Yeah.
but
Oh, yeah.
you noting that we need to be careful is a really good reminder that I'll take and hopefully internalize because I that's something that I when the intuition and you risk seeing your own face in the mirror of antiquity, your anxiety spikes a little bit and says, "Hang on, let me pump the brakes."
Mhm.
Yeah.
The big questions to me are the really interesting ones, like you're saying, big cycles and ways of kind of understanding patterns. Yeah, that's what we all want. And then when you if you open the Journal of Archaeology, you're going to be like, whoa, that's not what they're doing. Like, you just spent that whole article talking about three potsherds. I mean, it's so, even though the big questions are the interesting ones, you have to do the granular work, and it's really hard to it's hard to back up the big narratives with the kind of evidence you need to back up the big, and there are some, the like big history books that do a good job of this, of creating a narrative, creating a story, and they're popular for for that reason, because they found a story through human history, right? And that's really attractive to us. We love stories. I love stories, and I appreciate when scholars can do that. It's what I try to do in I teach one survey class that's kind of, caved cathedral.
Nice.
And you have to have these stories that go through it, so it's not just a, blah, big
Mhm.
pile of unconnected facts. But at the same time, those those stories, I don't know how to put it, but like, it's challenging to make the story hold up really well to the evidence, simply because there's so much variety in human experience, right? When you try to make any generalization about people, you there's always going to be a, yeah, but what about this
Mhm.
thing that doesn't support what you're saying? Well, what about this case that doesn't support what you're saying? So I like the big stories, I like the big narratives. I think they get people interested. I think they get our minds working in really good ways. But you kind of need to come back to the article with the three potsherds and say, but let's look at the evidence too and really see if it supports that.
So let me chart our course for a sec, because there it seems like we could probably make a couple of moves and get into talking about the Immortality Key and kind of what that narrative is framed in for people, because that's certainly a popular narrative. Uh, so could we talk a bit about art? Could we move into art and ecstasy and ecstatic experience and
Mm-hmm.
what you're seeing, and then talk about this book related to the current kind of modernity's resistance to
Yeah,
um, alternate states of consciousness, and then go into the immortality key work that we were talking about.
sure.
Cool.
Yeah, so art and ecstatic experience. I mean, I'm I'm still, this is something that I'm still kind of trying to understand in my own mind. Like, what is the connection? If you are making, let's just use really simple terms, making a picture in whatever sense that reflects an ecstatic experience, that reflects some kind of, shamanic journey, let's say. Um, is that because you just had that experience? Are you in the experience? Are you telling someone about the experience through your through storytelling that involves making pictures? And I don't know. I think it I think that, again, that probably depends on the context. Like, if I think about Gobekli Tepe and these buildings that have the carvings and have this sort of huge um, anthropomorphic human formed structure in the middle and benches around the outside, these are community buildings, and whatever spiritual experience is reflected in all of that art is being shared with the community through that art. Um, and I imagine that there's an experience that people are having together, perhaps, but maybe they're also hearing about an experience that already happened. And I don't know that I'm ready to say exactly what that is. Do you get what I'm saying?
I do. What and yet I'm also curious what what are the options? Like what, because the main question here is that I'm going through is, okay, like you turn on the radio and you're going to hear a lot of songs about broken hearts and relationships and sadness, and then you're going to hear songs about empowerment and various calls to action, and you'll hear politically motivated songs. And so I could go do a solid evaluation of music and kind of make certain um, inferences about why people might be producing that
Mm,
mode of
mhm.
expression. So there seems to, I mean, this art that people are producing is trying to do what with ecstatic experience? Like, is it a calling card? Is it a tribal expression? Does it mark a community? Is it related to death and one's understanding with death? Like, how are those?
Those are good options.
Yeah. Okay.
You see what I'm doing? Like, I'm not going to
Yeah.
commit.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, you'd have to be looking at a specific instance to answer that question. And, you know, um, in one case, people may be focused on burial and on ideas of rebirth or ancestor veneration or family, I don't know, some kind of juju that moves through family lines, and so ancestors are important. So, there might be something like that. In another instance, you might need some community cohesion, and everyone's coming together because they're going to go through a process that reminds them of who they are as a group. I mean, I'm just making stuff up, but my
Well,
point is, like, it can be different in every instance, I think.
I want to hit like a meta part of our conversation right now and just state this clearly. You are a highly trained expert you have years of experience in the field. You've been teaching these ideas to young minds and old minds. You have been writing about and communicating with colleagues who are doing something similar. This has been a passion and a centralizing endeavor in your life, where I'm sure you get, everything from economics to uh, general affirmation of self and everything in between from this process. Is all that fair to say?
Yeah, more or
Yeah.
less.
And I want it to be known that I cannot pin you down on these. So I think that's important to note, that we're in a very, very tender period of time, and there are experts all over the place. And here I am sitting with one and trying to get, like, I notice my own like desires. I want you to say cycle, or I want you to say,
You're
and
frustrated.
yes, yes, because the and I'm just noting that, there are things that, and I'm willing to consider, like, one of the things that I think is my own process is that I want to sit with you, for example, and think out loud and have you bump up against where I'm kind of speaking to immaturely, or where I'm misinformed. I really want these corrections, but I don't know that a lot of people are willing to feel that. I'm uncomfortable because I want some of my beliefs to be confirmed, and they're not, and then I've got to challenge myself, and we don't tend to like that. And so
Mhm.
I just think that's important to note, that your expertise, and you're not like doubling down on some of these interpretations. You're trained and you desire, your ethic is to stay in a space of, not sure.
We don't know until we know. Um,
But
and
there's a lot of people who act like they know.
yeah, I know.
So just I just
They
I,
do. But that's a part of academia that I've never, that's a space I don't want to be right. I don't want everyone to go, wow, Costello found the answer. She's right. That, like, I don't care. I have
uh,
no academic ego, and that's probably held me back in some ways, but
oh, I bet it
I don't
has. Yeah.
care. I think that the insistence on seeing something one way, I think that's bad academic ego at play. I think a good academic conversation is someone who says, I think it's this, and I say, cool. I don't totally agree, but I like that idea.
Mhm.
I just see it more this way. And they might say, yeah, that's cool.
Mhm.
Or she's full of shit. I mean, I don't know,
Well,
but
she's
that
frustrating as shit right
it's
now.
a
That's
conversation.
what.
Yeah. It's a conversation. And
Right.
maybe I'm trying to leave too much space, and that's what's frustrating. But I guess
No, I like it.
I think maybe where we're pushing up a little bit too is our different disciplines, right?
Yeah.
Because you are thinking about, I assume, the human mind in a way, right? I mean, that's what you're trained.
Yeah, I mean, I want to think about healing, where we connect with meaning, how we understand where we fit, what our identity is, what do our languages and various forms of expression reveal about things that are happening in our unconscious related to our culture, and the culture that is created out of that collision of all those different, like that. But I find myself really looking from a healing perspective, because I'm very interested in how people are coming to understand themselves and how they fit in the cosmos.
Yeah, and I think you can find those answers. They just might not be packaged as tidily as we might want them to be, because I think part of my reluctance to settle on one particular answer is just human variability. If I've learned anything, it's that people are going to interpret the same thing
Right.
many different ways as there are people.
Just come into a couples session and look at couples therapy happening.
Yeah,
Because I
yeah.
think that's the essence, right? Like if
Yes, it is.
at our
It's
core,
Rashomon.
yes,
It's like, everyone is going to
yeah,
see things differently. And that's on one level, but then build that into a society. And this society constructs, their package differently than this society constructs their package. And they're going to be dealing with the anxieties and finding ways to heal and the different things we've been talking about in really different ways. Now, the universals, which is kind of what we keep
mm-hmm.
playing around with, yeah, like there do seem to be these patterns. And Winckelmann's chapter in this book is amazing because he has been doing this work for decades, right? And what he's been doing is the work of an anthropologist, collecting all of that varied evidence and looking for the patterns, like you're saying, and saying, look, I can say that some societies have healers, some have witches, some have these different sort of types of religious specialists, say, and these are the patterns. And he is like, he's finding those patterns by doing the kind of work that I'm comfortable with, which is look at all the details. Don't make an assumption. Even if it feels intuitive, I want to see the evidence. And he's kind of brought the receipts through his work.
It's a great chapter. I'm
Yeah.
going to be reaching out to him.
Yeah, he's just an amazing person too. Yeah.
Well, so let's take that opportunity and go there, because I'm curious how you got this book together and what your selection process. Because we haven't really even been deep into what's happening in this book. I mean, you're really doing an
Sure.
overview of
Mhm.
these ideas that we're just lightly touching on so far. So take that and run with it.
Okay. Yeah. So it kind of started with conversations between me. Sorry, my printer just decided to start demanding attention. I don't know what's going on over there, but I'm going to ignore it. So my co-editor, Diana Stein, and I were doing kind of similar work. We didn't know each other, but we kept finding we were looking at seals and looking at this type of imagery and kind of coming to some of the same conclusions. And I was like, hey, Diana, you seem like you're doing some of these things that I'm doing. And she's like, yeah, well, let's talk about a project. And I really give her so much of the credit because she was the energy behind this in a lot of ways. So, and then she brought in Karen Foster, who's worked on this in the Aegean area, Minoans and in particular. And between the three of us and our different professional networks, we started reaching out to people who we knew were working. And what we wanted was a wide range. We wanted to show, in a sense, our project was to show that ecstatic experience really is everywhere. And if you look at the Hittite world, you're going to find something. If you look at Mesopotamia, you're going to find something. If you look at Egypt, you're going to find something. Minoans, a lot of people have worked on, but what about Mycenaeans? So we were doing this kind of by just talking to a lot of people and trying to, in some cases, push them a little bit and say, well, couldn't you though? Don't you maybe want to ask this question about, the Mycenaeans? Like, isn't there something that you would want to say about this? Is there ecstatic experience there? And in other cases, there was no pushing required. They were like, yeah, I've been doing this for 30 years. I'll write a chapter for you. So we also wanted to get a range, not just geographically, like I was just saying, but how do you find the evidence? So what we call archaeological correlates, right? this is a set of behaviors and things, as I was saying earlier, that happen in your mind. How do we find traces of that materially? So let's get some archaeobotanists, and let's talk to people who know the texts inside out and what evidence is there in the texts, and let's get people who look at art, and let's get people who, so really trying to get the different types of evidence so that somebody who wants to understand ecstatic experience in the ancient world better could look through this book and say, oh, I see. So a scientist could look at traces of, in vessels or something and find traces of the actual materials people were ingesting, or somebody could look at the art, and you get a sense of the different sort of paths you could take to find evidence of ecstatic experience. And in some cases, it's, it's slim, and you might say, okay, I can see that this, I don't know, text is talking about a ritual that seems to point to an ecstatic experience. Is it a smoking gun? Not exactly, but it's a clue. It gives us the sense that, yeah, this was part of their world.
Like cannabis on the altar.
Well, that's a smoking gun.
That's pretty.
That's a pretty good one. Yeah,
Right.
we need more of that. Yeah, I heard there aren't reviews out yet because the book is still new, so I'm interested in what the reviews will look like. But I heard that somebody who's in the area of Mesopotamia in particular looked at the book and said, yeah, very interesting book, but I'm not sold on the Mesopotamia part. I don't think they did this, which is hilarious to me, that someone's take would be, okay, it's basically universal, but not in Mesopotamia, like not my ancient people. They
Right.
weren't doing it, right? No, 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 no. It was much more proper and structured than that, or something,
Yeah,
you know.
people, it should be noted, people, we were mentioning Carl Ruck or Amon Hillman. These are people who have made these claims about drugs in antiquity or entheogens, however we want to, and they get axed. And it's a struggle, if you're trying to make this claim in the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and right now it's of course different, but yeah, it's really interesting that we find that to be heretical and kick
Mm-hmm.
it out of the canon.
And it comes back to that kind of seeing yourself in the past. I think sometimes when we look at certain ancient societies, Greeks, Romans, Mesopotamians, there are things that look so familiar to us that I do think some scholars look at the past and imagine it's like today, but with togas or something. And when they come across evidence that shows that, like, oh no, something that would look super weird to us was actually going on, it's uncomfortable, and they don't really like that. Now, there are plenty of other people who love that, who are like, oh, the past was super weird, let's read more. But
Yeah,
I do think that sometimes people don't like this. I mean, it's just like today. Some people are accepting of, you know, eccentricity or behavior that seems deviant to them, and other people really aren't. So
a lot of it seems to do with sex.
yeah, often.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's like who we are as a society, right?
Yeah, consistently repressing on some level,
Yeah.
trying to eradicate. They yeah. Yeah, I think it's convenient that people look back on antiquity and they just kind of glance over the orgy scenes that happened, and they go, no, that wasn't involved in religion, of course not.
But it happened in antiquity too. And I'm getting out of my area of expertise. So but what you have the Greeks, and then their neighbors in Italy were the Etruscans.
Hmm.
And the Etruscans were into some kind of neat stuff. They were into divination and magic, and but the Greeks didn't really understand them and sometimes really misinterpreted. So, and I can't back this up, but this is just something that I've read, that they had the same kinds of drinking parties, right? These symposia that the Greeks had, but the Greeks, only men were involved unless they were there for sex, because women didn't take part in that,
Hmm.
part in any really public role in society except religion. So women didn't get to go to the dinner parties. Nice women, right? As we might say. But for the Etruscans, they did. You would go with your wife, just like today you would, right? You're going to go out for the evening, you go with your partner. And then evidently the Greeks saw this and just misunderstood completely and thought Etruscan women must be like essentially whores, that these women were sleeping around, because why would they be at a symposium if they weren't there to provide sex?
Classic slut shaming from
Yeah, slut shaming,
misunderstanding. Yeah.
and also just
Yeah.
cultural misunderstanding,
Yes.
right? That
Yeah.
happens all the time today, but it happened back then. And when we look at the past, we do it. It's just, we have such a hard time looking outside of
Yeah.
our own. That was a very long example, but you can edit that out if you wish. But
No, actually, the
it,
more those stories come out, I like that. I really like those threads because
yeah.
it grounds it. I don't, and it's also like remember, you said it's like a playground. And for me, I really do like hearing people who have been mining these territories speak, just free associate with what comes up. Thank you for that. Uh, so, where does that take us? Because we're sitting in a place looking at antiquity, ecstatic. Oh yeah, you know what? I want to define a couple of terms. Because would you define what you mean when you say ecstatic experience, and what you think religion was at the time, and if that's an appropriate way to talk
Yeah,
about it?
no, that's a really good question. I'll probably frustrate you by not answering directly.
We know
But
this is going to happen already.
terminology is tricky in this area.
Yeah.
There's kind of a history in the discipline anthropology, archaeology, of trying to box things in a little bit so that religion only applies to, say, an organized religion with, I don't know, these three characteristics. And if not, we're not talking about religion, we're talking about something else, ritual or belief, or, so I don't really like that. I think that those are not really helpful divisions. I think that they're ethnocentric and
Hmm.
hierarchical and judgmental, potentially can really be misused. So for me, when I say religion, I really am talking about something spiritual, something in which people are engaged with the spiritual. And what's also really worth keeping in mind is that, again, today we put these things in boxes so that you do your religion on Friday or Saturday or Sunday. And then other days you're doing your mundane things, or you have a prayer before a meal, and then you're done with the religion, right? So often it's in these very discrete packages, and it really seems that in much of the ancient world, it was just all mixed in together. I mean, so is it superstition or is it religion? If, like, you don't step on a sidewalk crack
Hmm.
today, or you don't walk under a ladder, we call it superstition, but those kinds of small behaviors might have been really woven into people's lives. And I wouldn't want to take all of that and just put it into some, you know, little box and call it superstition as though it's not important. I think that that was part of religion as well, in the sense that that's the way people were seeing the bigger forces in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I like religion as a really encompassing term.
I do too. People, Thomas More, when I talked to him years ago, a couple of years back, he had a book called Your Own Religion or something, and he said he regretted including religion in the title because the publisher urged him not to, but apparently people have a lot of associations with the word religion. I just love it so much and think that I mean it in the way that we're talking about it right now.
Mhm.
To reconnect with something that's seemingly outside of my um, perceptual limitations, my
Yeah,
comprehension. Uh,
yeah. We use language in really limiting ways, right? I mean, we use it to put things, I don't know, like magic even. We do the same thing, right? Magic is silly, and it's these things, but maybe magic is a lot more than that.
well, and you're actually hitting on something important that not to be too productive here, but the act of having ecstasy in your religious tradition sets you up to make being in the unknown a core value of your life experience.
Mm-hmm,
Tracking so far, right?
mm-hmm,
So if we're talking about a holistic model of human experience, then I think on a basic level, and this is where my psychologist hat comes out, on a basic level, when people have they have not had reductive conclusions that they believe are right, so that's a harmful toxic pattern. That when
right.
I conclude that I understand reality and I'm correct and you act in this way and not that way, that's toxic and harmful. So in a communal social space, to have some kind of principle that connects each individual with the reminder and the repetitive ritualization of ecstasy, where to use psychological terminology, the ego gets kind of kicked
Mm-hmm.
out of the driver's seat. And 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 back to this categoricalization of, maybe that's a word, to the impulse or the instinct to categorize is taken out for the moment, and so I'm communing, or whatever word you want to use. So that seems to be a value. Now here, modern day, we have a real twisted relationship. Earlier I made a comment about an alcohol cult. That's not contained in a kind of religious tradition. It's seeped out, and so now
Mm-hmm.
it's real.
Mm-hmm.
It's toxic. That
Right.
even so, this reminds me of that one participant reminded Amon Hillman reminded me that Paul walks around and says, "You guys are using this. You guys are doing wrong. You're not using the sacrament in the way it's intended to be used." One could say that when alcohol goes out of the religious tradition, we've got people using alcohol to just relax, at the end of a day,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to having a religiously minded culture that puts somebody into relationship with ecstasy and productivity and community and family and support and models of connection and collaboration, and also models of contemplation and individual spiritual work, right? That seems like that's a holistic model of a human. And yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I like
Okay.
that. I do. I think that that makes a lot of sense. And I like that a lot about Marescu's book, is that he set up that sort of model of saying, look, it was there and it was removed, and we've been left with something that's not that's sort of dry, right? The dry
Hmm.
cracker
Hmm.
of religion in a way. And I think that pointing it out as in a way where its absence is what's notable rather than its presence,
Hmm.
is it's a really powerful way of
Hmm.
kind of shifting your paradigm. And I think that's what you're saying too, right?
I am.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And of course it's even worse in our society, because then we like add on shame.
Oh yeah.
um and not healthy.
Well, you end up being a human being who needs to, this is so, I got to be careful here, but I do think I do think we need to get, we have a meta experience of ourselves. I think there is a kind of urge to self reflect, talking about one of those eternal patterns. So we have to be able to look seemingly down upon ourselves and pay attention to what's happening and make certain course corrections to our process based upon our instincts and our culture and our nature and our identity and our experience and our history and
Mhm.
and navigating all that territory. I'm not only having conflicts with people out there, I'm having conflicts in here all the time. And so to have a kind of soul tending process in the culture at large in order to provide that expansiveness and moments away from the kind of the orienting factors of the ego, which are always going to be categorizing and evaluating and projecting into the future and planning and kind of worst case scenarioing, and
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
got to just shut the fuck up every now and then and like let me connect with something beyond this chaos that seemingly is imaged by the Buddhists as a monkey mind that's swinging from all these branches. And you're like, Jesus, how can I know, let me have a really healthy place that I can go make sense of the world, which means to be in no sense, to be
Yeah.
in no cis, and I run the risk of romanticizing antiquity when I imagine that like some dude who's gone into a cave for 10 days and fasted and I'm sure is malnourished and miserable and has a vision. And I'm like, oh shit, yeah, I need to go to the dark retreat in Tibet. So that I do,
Yeah.
I like this thread and that we're talking about how what's the problem when there's not this that's present. And part of what happens is it gets absorbed into social dynamics that reify that behavior, alcohol, I'm talking about primarily, and taking it out of the spiritual context.
And I mean, not just alcohol, right? But drugs as
Yeah.
well. And this is, a concern that I have. I am encouraged by seeing so much really interesting new research on psychedelics, for
Yeah.
example, that's happening. And I think we need to explore the therapeutic potential. I'm worried about opening the floodgates and creating the kind of thing you're talking about with alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the 18-year-old who wants to experiment, that's been happening always, right? And
Right.
how often does that yield the kind of truly mind-opening, expansive, healing experience that we're talking about? I don't know. I'm pretty square and didn't go there myself, but
I was
I'm
not.
saying like I
Just
I don't think that I think you're probably more often in the like binge drinking kind of um category. I don't
well,
know.
so not that I'm trying to make a moral claim here, but there is as I'm thinking through these kinds of issues, I tend to think, well, the culture is real. Like we didn't create the
Right,
culture's not there to create the container.
right.
This is Jeff Kripal's whole entire like, wow, it's whatever kind of representations we currently have of a phenomena, of a given phenomena. If something activates that's outside of that model, it goes out into all these weird places. And I think for people like us, it's like, well, I want to look at all those weird places. And Freud was doing it, Jung was doing it, philosophers have done it. They're talking about taboos.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, sexuality is on that list. Violence is on that list. Alternate states of consciousness are on that list. And that's where these private communities started to develop, I imagine, that's just how I would have done it, is that I would have said, wow, this is really radical, except those people over there are going to judge me for doing this. So I'm going into a cave, and then I'm going to venture into the cave one day and see you sitting in the cave and go, oh shit,
Mhm.
we're on this same thread, you know? And then we have a community that develops that's on that same thread. It- and and so that I just think that there's something very important about to I think to mirror this again, about us not having our religions right now are anti alternate states of consciousness. They're anti expressions of ecstasy, and that includes the body and sexuality, and you can't talk about orgasm, like and I do this with families where we say, oh my god, like, you haven't talked to your kids about sex. That's not the data is that's not going to help them. It in fact hurts them. And so
Mhm.
to normalize the ways in which we seek out alternate states of consciousness, or they spontaneously emerge and allow us to talk openly about them, the fact that we not only don't have that, and then we feel ashamed for not for even thinking about that, is pretty powerful today. So that's why I look at antiquity. I'm like, these folks got something
know.
that
I
we
know.
don't
I mean,
get.
we all do it. We all romanticize it. It's, but it's part of the fun, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, oh, I want so badly a time machine. I really, really want.
Well, what would you do? Where would you go if you had that? What would be the thing you if you got one trip?
I mean, I'd probably have to go to the Neolithic because I've spent so much time thinking about it. The Neolithic, as though it's like one moment. But yeah. I mean, yeah. It would
What do you
be.
think? Were newly nomadic tribes going after big game and eating mushrooms off their shit and having alternate states of consciousness in the this is where we're going now.
I guess. I mean, this has all kind of come full circle, in the sense that, like, there's always going to be some kind of a structure for it, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
In most cases. And I think that's what we're seeing back in the Paleolithic, in the Neolithic. I think even in these early moments, structures are created to contain, if you want to say contain, or maybe you could say nurture if you wanted to use a different word, but to create a space for that to happen, that it's not necessarily just um, random, but it's being used to amplify the desired outcome of the group. I see, this is when I start sounding like an anthropologist or
Yeah,
sociologist
it
or
is
something
so
again,
reductive.
but
Yeah, I do that shit all the time. It's like, no. Yeah.
yeah. But it's not like a free for all, I guess is what
Yeah.
I'm saying. And it never was. Like, it was always ecstatic experience is sort of what I mean, but always, probably, I know, but part of a structured and somewhat controlled set of behaviors. And I think what's interesting is seeing how those structures and controls change in different moments. And when you have a more hierarchical society, who's controlling it and who has access to it, not everyone, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Versus a different situation where maybe more people have access to it. Someone's still probably, in some sense, controlling it. You need to have a specialist, you need to have a guide, you need to have people who are um, keeping everyone else on the rails. And uh, I think I am just speculating now.
It's but that, to me, we have to be on the verge of something to be creative. I mean, that's one thing about walking that line between, yeah, we've got our processes, we've got our biases, we've got our ethics that we operate by, and I'm also going to have to play on the playground of what if and maybes and could it be's, and
Mhm.
it's, but to remember to balance oneself by what we know, and to have a place for that, to be able to go into dream world about, you know, it is very interesting to contemplate where we in our human growth and development, what was lost, because this happens in one's personal life. I find that people that I work with in their second halves of life, we all tend to be oriented to picking up the threads that were dropped in our earlier lives, to take a more mature understanding or go at what we had to drop off. This is why I've got 60-year-olds who are like, I want to get a pottery wheel, or I want to start smoking pot, or I want to finally go on that trip. There's I want to give expression for the things that I had to drop. And so
Mhm.
I'm wondering, is that a fractal? Is that something that we can look at and say, well, there's a microcosm in my lived experience that might be an amplification of what happens in a universal pattern to other people as well? And so, can I look at things like marital conflict and my own identity formation and what's happening in the later stages of my life, and make certain inferences based upon that into what we collectively do? Owning that I'm going to get something wrong, because it's not just, I can't just map one to one, but it's
Mhm.
certainly a decent heuristic to say that probably happens.
Yeah,
Fair to say.
definitely. And I think thinking about that, the way you just said it, a useful heuristic, like that's kind of what we're doing in all of this, right? It's like, let's use this model to try to understand. Let's see where that takes us. Oh, I learned
Yeah.
something, right? Does that mean that that is the single correct model and way to understand the world? Well, no, but that was helpful. And now
Yeah.
let's try this one and let's think about it this way. And um, yeah, and anything we can use to try to kind of get a better perspective and a better understanding. And that's what you're doing in archaeology. I mean, ultimately, yeah, it's fun to learn about the ancient world. Maybe we're all just trying to understand ourselves better by doing that, right? In some sense. So,
Yeah. And this gets weird. This gets into like the paranormal of timelessness and what is time. And if I, find some book that's giving the answer to what I've been searching for, that there's magic in that. And I love what you're saying, to reflect a fellow I recently spoke with, Bernardo Castrop, who's somebody who's been very helpful in these territories. He calls them convenient fictions. And
mm,
he says that, that we're consistently, everything from our understanding of medicine to psychology to what environment and sciences, they're all convenient fictions. And we know in academia, what is innovation is met with uh, harsh consequences. Oftentimes, it's not necessarily met with um, open arms.
mhm,
Even back to what you're saying, we can't really talk about alternate states of consciousness because people go, no, that wasn't happening. And so finally, you've got the fire up underneath you, and you're putting out this book on alternate states of consciousness and ecstatic experience. And to me, it's exactly what I needed in this thread. As I told you earlier, I'm your perfect patient. I'm like, I'm so stoked to read this book. I'm tearing through it, because part of what when I talked to Brian Marescu, and life started to open up in ways that were pretty magical, because I realized, like, I'm covered up by all these books that are pointing toward this area that you're
mhm.
researching. And so there's something really wild that's happening right now. So on that thread though about Brian's work, what'd you think about when you read it? Uh,
um, I love it. In a lot of ways, that was kind of my initial response was like, oh, this is awesome. Right. And then the part of me that's an academic was like, oh, I don't really like what he did with this area, or, oh, I'm not comfortable with that conclusion. So, of course, I mean, that's how I read. I'm a critical reader, right?
right.
So it's kind of my job. So, yeah, I definitely ran up against some of those places where like the narrative doesn't hold in my view, but I like the narrative. And that's sort of what I was saying earlier about stories, and in a sense, it's about who you're trying to reach and how you're trying to reach them. We need, I mean, nobody's going to just, maybe except you, is going to pick up ecstatic experience in the ancient world who isn't an archaeologist, who, you know, I mean, it's a, we really, now I will say, we tried very hard. We did an enormous amount of editorial labor on this book to make it a readable book, to make it
It's
something
very
that's
readable.
accessible.
I'll push up against that. I don't think it's an inside baseball book. I think there's ample opportunity for people involved in these questions that, like, if anybody's been watching or listening to the podcast, this is your book. Like
But that's not what I meant. Like, I agree with you. I want anyone who's interested in those questions to read this book. But what I'm saying is, if you weren't already
okay, I got
interested, you might not. This isn't going to be on the New York Times bestsellers list like
You mean
Brian's
this
book.
this thing? This beast?
Right, because, you know, someone who isn't already interested in the subject isn't going to just pick this up and, like, it's not, and find it to be a page turner, because it's the evidence, right? It's like I said, Winkleman's bringing the receipts. It's kind of like the receipts. For Brian's book, Brian is telling this story that is captivating, and which I think is hopefully getting people really interested.
Right.
And I hope it brings them to our book. Right. But that's the power of what he's doing, is he's telling a story. I mean, he has incredible skill in making it exciting and making sense of a lot of different moments in time and bits of evidence, and kind of weaving it into a big story. And I'm all for that. I, you know, as I said, I don't love some of the leaps, some of the ways the dots are connected. Don't connect to me, but I like it conceptually, and I think it's a really exciting book.
I imagine it's really, I mean, I know it'd be very hard to be the expert of a lot of disciplines, you know. So when we write books, we got to try to mine from all the people that can talk about, that are the experts.
Yeah.
So in the spirit of time, I'm aware that we need to start wrapping up.
Sure.
But there's so much more here, Sarah. This is I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these ideas, because it seems like one of the places we're landing is the what's not there, and it's not that, maybe it has, maybe that is decent, that we've lost something, a container for ecstatic experience, but it doesn't go away. It goes into very hidden places, or
Mm-hmm.
seeps into the culture at large and finds little shadowy ways to express itself. And usually this phrase dates me, but sex, drugs, and rock and roll all contain these ecstatic um, aspects of our experience, which is why a rock concert can be a very, you know, on some level, a deeply religious experience.
Mm-hmm.
So, just closing out, what threads are left hanging? What needs to be included in our recipe here?
Well, I hope that people will take a look at the book, in the sense that I think they're going to find, we just cover so much ground, you know, as I said, geographically, methodologically, in terms of the different types of evidence. I think there's something new for people to discover there. And I'm also really hoping that, like, some of the people who are maybe in my field, who haven't before been comfortable thinking about this aspect of human behavior, will find this to be a comfortable place to start thinking about it. You know, we're staying within the bounds of good archaeological evidence. We're, you know, we've got all the footnotes. It's good research by good scholars, and I hope this pushes the field forward a little bit, and makes it easier for our disciplines to get into some. I mean, I feel like the questions we were talking about today, John, are just so interesting and so elemental to who we are as people. And I want to have those conversations about people in the ancient world too,
Hmm.
and let that be a part of what we're talking about when we look at the ancient world.
Yeah, I think any spiritual tradition that's worth any time and attention has a kind of lineage in it. It's either going to be the lineage of the plants and plant teachers or the lineage of academia, but having a kind of lineage to locate oneself is important. And if a large part of our human experience, the kind of the nature of the transcendent, isn't, if we've already made conclusions about that, then we're not in relationship with mystery. So that's one of the major takeaways that I'm really leaving with today. And I really appreciate this time and energy. And I've basically got your list of contributors as a podcast participant list.
Good.
Y'all did such a good job on this book. And in the intro, I will have read through some of the selections in the table of contents. So yeah, if you're thinking about it, it's a beast of a book, but it's not a necessarily a cover to cover read. It's a mine through it and use it for a long, long time because you'll be looking at this book for a while. Anything else you want to direct people anywhere?
No,
Good.
no.
I'll do all the directing.
Okay.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time. And this is a helpful dive into some territory that I'm just beginning to get deeper and deeper into. So thank you.
Well, thanks. Thanks for, having the conversation with me, and thanks for making this space more generally for this kind of conversation to happen. I think you're doing great work here.
Thanks. And just, yeah, one note that I think is important is that there's something, and this is a kind of Freudian Jungian split, where our medicine and medical, what we medicalize, because ecstatic experience is medicalized in some way right now. It's problematic. It's psychotic, or it's to be avoided. And I think that's one of our problems today, is that we have so much anxiety about uncertainty that we don't create a habit of being in uncertain spaces. So, public service announcement. Thanks again. Give me 1 sec, and we'll chat for a second. So much appreciated, Sarah.